Hello and welcome. I'm Chris Braitch, and this is the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I am an emotional health and leadership coach and co-founder of the not-for-profit Seen and Heard, which supports those seeking healing, connection, and systemic change. My vision is to move myself and the world around me towards connection and compassion. And each week, I will connect with amazing guests who are on their journey to bring about meaningful change in their own lives and the world around them. Thanks for being here. Let's get started. Welcome everybody to the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Warren Larkin. Dr.
Hi.
Warren Larkin is a consultant clinical psychologist and founder of Warren Larkin Associates, established in 2017 to help organisations become more trauma-informed. Before that, he spent 25 years in the NHS, working with individuals and families affected by serious mental health difficulties. Warren went on to lead one of the two national centres of excellence in psychological care for psychosis, chosen to share and disseminate innovative practice in the first episode, Psychosis Services. Warren then spent 5 years as a network clinical director responsible for children and family services across Lancashire, and he's remained an active lecturer and researcher, holding many honorary academic positions, including for the last 6 years a visiting professor position at the University of Sunderland. He has a long-standing interest in the relationships between childhood adversity and outcomes later in life, and has published numerous research articles on the topics of adverse childhood experiences and trauma and psychosis, and published an edited book in 2006 exploring this theme, which we'll have a little talk about later. Warren completed a 2-year tenure as the clinical lead for the Department of Health Adverse Childhood Experiences Programme, and has also been involved in policy development and acted as an advisor to a number of UK and foreign government agencies. Warren is currently co-leading the implementation of trauma-informed approaches in 100 secondary schools in England, which is being evaluated by means of a randomised controlled trial funded by the Youth Endowment Fund and the Home Office. Welcome, Warren.
Wow, thanks, Chris. I'm going to have a word with whoever wrote that because it just went on and on and on. Yeah, definitely got to do something about it. Yeah, thanks for that. Anyway,
no worries at all. It just shows a rich history, and it gives listeners a little picture of where you've been. So it's great, and it's lovely to have this time together today. Thanks for making time.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, we first connected, I believe, through Piers Cross. Cross, who's my coach and very busy in the space of talking about adverse childhood experiences, particularly with boarding schools, and so we really connected around the film Boarding on Insanity, which there is a screening coming up in Parliament on the 19th of January 2026, and I believe you're going to be speaking at that.
I am, believe it or not, yes. It sounds like a really exciting event that Piers has organised, and you're in the film, aren't you, Chris? I watched it the other day, actually.
Yeah,
for the first time. Really powerful. And yeah, so speaking at the event in Westminster, I mean, I think somebody famous must have dropped out because they asked me, but there are lots of really famous people who've been advocates in this area. And I think the fact that, MPs can attend and it's being heard in Westminster, I think it's a really important development. And hopefully it'll lead to more advocacy for the cause of reforming the boarding school system.
Beautiful, thank you, Warren. I won't be too much of a fanboy, but you'll be pleased to know you were the first name on the list. So no one had to drop out. You were the first.
Well, thank you. That's very good to know.
Yeah,
I must have that to my CV.
Yeah. Cool. So it gives us a chance now, really, to explore your work, your life, and I always like to start by hearing a little bit about how things were for people when they were young, because it's these experiences in your work that shape us into the adults we become and the work we do and our passions and our challenges. So, yeah, how were things for you when you were growing up?
That's a very serious question. See, I ask this question to people a lot in my career, but it's not been asked to me very often. So I'm kind of now realising it's quite a big deal to answer that question. I think I was very lucky in my home life in that my parents were married for, 60 years by the time my dad died. So I feel like I had a stable home environment. One sibling, sister, 8 years older. So I don't think she'll mind me saying that we didn't always see eye to eye or necessarily have a lot in common because we were like a different generation, really. but yeah, I was pretty lucky in terms of my home environment. My dad was a professional rugby league player and a coal miner, um, as was his dad, coal miner that is. And my mum gave up work when they started a family, so to look after the kids. So we've always had that, that kind of asset as well, that my mum was always dedicated to raising a family. So, so yeah, I feel like I was pretty lucky. I mean, I think anybody that makes out that their kind of childhood and their family life was perfect is clearly not remembering properly. And I do think Philip Larkin was right about your mum and dad. But ultimately, I think I was pretty fortunate. So yeah, and I lived in an area where, in the street that we lived in, we knew everybody knew everybody else, everybody looked out for each other. It was a community, So again, that was really fortunate. But there was someone who lived nearby that had very serious mental health issues, and that, I think, was important because back then there was a lot of stigma around mental health problems, I think. And the interesting thing was my mum and my grandma kind of looked after this person, just kind of went round to make sure they were okay, made sure they had, provisions, and they, did their washing and all those kinds of things, and just tried to help them cope a bit better. So I kind of realised that actually people with, severe mental health problems aren't necessarily, it's not something to be feared. It's actually a vulnerability, and actually, we ought to be kind and compassionate and support people to live their lives, even if they're struggling. But it did leave me wondering why. How do you get to a point where you're detached from reality, or having very scary thoughts, or delusional beliefs or whatever? And it did make me really curious about that. So I think I learned, I think that taught me two things. One is community is really important, and social support is really important. And if you have enough of it, you can cope with really difficult personal and social circumstances. But also, it made me really curious about mental health issues and what helps us cope and what kind of causes it. How do we end up in a situation where our mental health is really poor? So I think that was probably quite influential. And then, ask a psychologist about the childhood, Chris. You're going to be here for a while, so just talk through whatever you need. School, I didn't really enjoy, if I'm quite honest. I mean, there are obviously positives. I've got positive memories, but overall, didn't really. I don't look back with like massively fond memories. I kind of particularly found secondary school quite stressful, and left with limited qualifications, basically. So had to resit maths and English because I couldn't get a job. Couldn't get an interview for a job, never mind a job. All the pits had shut at that point, so I couldn't do what my dad had done. And so it was like, well, what do I do? So my dad said, you better go and resit maths and English, which I did at a sixth form, a different school. And it was at that sixth form that I experienced a very different kind of educational environment, which was just much more kind of, I don't know, it just seemed calmer, more orderly. The staff were very supportive. It just seemed, I mean, we were a little bit older, weren't we? 16, 17. But it just seemed like a different experience. And I was encouraged a lot and realised that I wasn't not smart. I was actually quite bright, but maybe I just hadn't had the right kind of support in the right environment. So I started learning, and they said, well, why aren't you doing A-levels? And I was like, that's never even been on the agenda. So they encouraged me to do that, and I kind of talked to mum and dad about it, and they was like, well, why not, I guess? Give it a go. So I did. I did an A-level in psychology, in medieval history and religious studies, and didn't pass all the things that I wanted the first time, so I resat those exams and did all right, and then went to university, went to Hull University, which is what I wanted, and studied psychology. So that was a real turning point in my life. That resitting my maths and English O-levels was a massive turning point, but it made me realise that education has a fundamental part to play in your social and emotional development and your life chances. And if children are experiencing high levels of stress at school for whatever reason. And I've been recently diagnosed with ADHD, so that might have had part to play in it, but that was never a question when I was younger. It kind of made me realise that lots of children, the educational system as it stands, might not meet their needs. It might not be optimal for their way of learning or their way of making sense of the world. And they can leave secondary school feeling that they've not got a lot of options, that they're not particularly bright, they've not got huge potential, not much self-belief. And that kind of limits their life, you know. Mm-hmm. Whereas I had the opposite experience where I went to sixth form with those limiting beliefs and lack of self-worth, you know, and actually they turned that around for me. So I think, so now I'm really interested in schools as an area of application for trauma-informed practice. Mm-hmm. I think it's such a massive influence on our life success. You know, and there's a massive study by Richard Layard and colleagues at London School of Economics where they followed children up through primary school, through secondary school, into their 30s. And at the age of 34, they did their kind of follow-up assessment, and they found that the strongest predictor of life success and satisfaction was, in their follow-up study, emotional well-being whilst at secondary school. Mm. And the worst predictor of life success at the age of 34 was intellectual attainment. So the system's skew if it's not balanced. You know, we focus on educational outcomes like exam results and those kind of things. And actually, that life course study suggests that your social and emotional well-being is a better predictor of your life success than what your exam results are at the age of 16. I mean, in my case, that's clearly borne out. Mm. So I'll stop there. But that's yeah.
Thank you, Warren. No, I really appreciate it. There's so much richness in there. But just on that last point of, you know, the importance of EQ, emotional intelligence ahead of IQ, and kind of, you know, there's still very much a focus on sort of a behaviourist approach in schools. IQ, you know, exams, attainment, constant testing. I mean, my girls are 14. They're in the local grammar school. And they are, you know, there's barely a day that goes by they're not being tested for something. And I think, where's the bit where they actually learn some stuff and have a play with some things, and you know?
Yeah, completely. I do think that I always said to my daughter, I've got 2 teenage daughters, you know, you can always reset exams, you can always redo qualifications later on. It's not the end of the world. It's not the be all and end all, because there's so much stress so much pressure placed on children at school, and the testing regime and the homework, and it's really high pressure. And then it ramps up when you go to do A levels, and then it ramps up again when you go to university. So, you know, I've always kind of put across the message that do your best, but the most important things to take from school are your relationships, your social skills, your opportunities to interact with people, your values, you know, your ambitions, your self-belief. They're the kind of things that matter. Everything else you can pick up later on, you know. This is probably not the right message for someone who's just delivered a randomised trial in hundreds of schools. But I just think it's more important that we produce not happy, that's the wrong word. I'm not sure happy is the right concept. Content, confident, self-assured young people with self-belief about what they can contribute. That's what I think schools should give to young people, because they're future citizens, they're our future society, and they're the ones steering, you know, the direction of our society going forward. So that's far more important to me than how many exams you've passed, you know.
Yeah, I hear you, Warren. Yeah, absolutely. And I think with AI now as well, you know, for me, AI can do the heavy lifting on the IQ, the left brainy stuff, freeing us up to go back to humaning. You know, we don't have to be encyclopedic about Latin and, you know, what year the Battle of Hastings was. It's just not useful stuff.
1066.
Yeah, there you go. We all got that one. But the grounding, you know, the strong emotional grounding, emotional intelligence, relationships, communication, they are the key predictors also of successful leadership. You know, Sophia's course and I have the Compassionate Leader Pathway course, and that's really, really clear that, you know, EQ outweighs IQ, sort of factors of 2 or 3 to 1, as far as a determinant for any sort of leadership. So particularly the independent school system that's very much still rigged up for, the old model of exams and university and, get a good job and all the rest of it. It creates like a flaw in the system into the person that at some point they're going to tip over for perfectionism, workaholism, whatever it might be.
Completely. And also this contingent self-esteem that, my self-worth is measured by how much I achieve or how well I perform, as opposed to my inherent value and qualities as a person. That is a massive problem in our society, and I think the current school system, promotes that idea. It's about how you succeed, how you perform, how much effort you put in, not that actually you've got value as a human being. You've got qualities and talents, and you've got things to bring that are part of who you are, not just what you do, So I think that is definitely something we need to address. I also think that the research on positive childhood experiences is really important as well, which has found that if children have experienced adversity, but at the same time they've had positive experiences to offset that adversity, they can do really well in life and not suffer from all the negative consequences that we associate with adverse childhood experiences. So we know, for example, that if you've had 4 adverse childhood experiences compared to someone who hasn't had any, you're like 7 times more likely to be dependent on alcohol. You're 11 times more likely to use crack or heroin or go to prison. You're 8 times more likely to be involved in violence in a 12-month period, and you're 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. So these massive increases in odds of poorer outcomes can be offset, because that's a dose-response relationship. The bigger the dose of adversity in childhood, the greater the risk that you'll have these poorer outcomes. And that pattern's been stable over 40-odd population studies over 25 years. The new research on positive childhood experiences, sometimes referred to as benevolent childhood experiences, indicates that even if you've had a whole load of adversity or toxic stress in childhood, if you had access to safe adults whilst that adversity was going on, if you had a sense of belonging and a sense of community, if you felt a part of the community at school, if you had supportive peers, if you had regular participation activities where you were part of a group, all of those things are protective, and they offset in the same dose-response way the adversity risks that we associate with childhood adversity. So people can live really healthy, have fantastic social support in adult life, really good mental health, even if they've had lots of adversity, if they've had some of the more of those experiences, those positive child experiences they've had, because it offsets the negative risks of adversity in childhood. So that for me is really positive, because we can do something about that. We can't always prevent childhood adversity, but I think we can prevent some of it. But we can always strive to ensure that children feel safe at school, that they've got trusted adults they can talk to at school, that they've got participation in activities where they feel a sense of belonging, where they've got positive peer relationships, where there's a sense of community and tradition. All of these things are things we can influence. For me, that is a really optimistic finding, and I think it needs to be something that we think about more in society, about all these touch points where children, young people come into contact with adults, or opportunities for group interaction or social development or cultural development. So yeah, that for me feels really optimistic in a field where sometimes it feels like there isn't a lot of optimism.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm connecting with that emotionally, because it fills me with hope about my parenting as well, because my kids haven't had an easy life at times. And the one thing they did have is they did have some people around to help them through it. And I've always get that parent guilt, that perfectionism, that they're going to be messed up like I was. They've been through all this stuff. Their brother died. They've been through a divorce. All this stuff is happening. But maybe those benevolent factors, those positive factors, may have helped steer a bit more. So thank you for a voice of hope.
Yeah, no, I also think it's normal to, as a parent, I think it's normal to look back and go, oh God, why did we do that? We should have done it differently. I think personally, I think it's a really natural urge to feel guilty about our less than perfect parenting, but we overlook all the positives that we've provided, all the protective factors, all the resilience factors, all the safety, the love, the nurture. That's really, really crucial, and I'm pretty sure that it offsets a few poor decisions or a few mistakes or a few unfortunate, situations. We're not perfect, and it's stressful and time. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And when you were talking about ACEs, the four or more, I connected that. I had 4 or more ACEs myself, and I was an alcoholic, gambler, many addictions as an adult, coping strategies, etc. But when you said it was, that inability to sort of process those along the way. So for me, being in a boarding school from 7, having, not much parental contact and being around adults who were not always benevolent or certainly present. I think, when I look back on it and the trauma work I do with clients as well, it's always, I was on my own. It's not necessarily always just what happened, it's what you made it mean. As Gabor Mate says, it's kind of the beliefs that come around it. They're the things that really do a number on people. Do you find that in your work?
Completely, yeah. I mean, I've worked with a few, maybe a handful of people that had psychosis as a result of some of their experiences in boarding school settings. I think ultimately, when you're young and you're at that age, you're creating your understanding of the world, yourself and other people. And I think we need, as humans, social interaction in a parental context, in a family context, to create that accurate map of the social world. And I think without it, we develop beliefs about ourselves, the world, and others that are not necessarily accurate and not necessarily helpful. What you develop is survival strategies and beliefs about yourself, the world, and other people that are functional in that setting, but not necessarily functional in the world afterwards, as a partner, a husband, a wife, an employee, a parent, So I think we develop these survival strategies in a particular context, and whilst they might work in that context, they're not very functional later on. And that's when we have to do the personal development work and the therapy to update those beliefs and strategies and go, well, they served me then because I was in this pretty unusual situation. But actually, this perfectionism, this urge to be exemplary in every way, that's not realistic in the adult grown-up world, right? It's not realistic as a parent. It's not realistic as a manager. It's not realistic as a husband. It's just not. It's easy to get, as a kid, you can study hard and get, 20 out of 20 on a test. But when it comes to being a parent or working a complicated job or being in a relationship with another person, you can't be perfect. You're always going to get it wrong, and that's part of life. But you're going to feel that you're unacceptable unless you can perform perfectly. And that's a miserable existence. So I used to always give clients a book chapter, and I'm struggling to remember who wrote it, but the book chapter was called Dare to be Average. And it was just wonderful. But the message was, if all you strive for is perfection, that's going to be like 1-2% of your experience. The rest of it is going to be disappointment, because most people can't be perfect most of the time. So actually enjoy the journey. The journey is more important than the destination. So if you focus on enjoying the process rather than the outcome, you're going to be much more happy.
Yeah.
Maybe it's okay to fail sometimes. Maybe it's good to fail sometimes.
Yeah, I really hear you. Good is good enough, and that was something that I've worked a lot with my children with myself as well. The perfectionism, the imposter syndrome, all that stuff, and we see it. The film we talk, Boarding on Insanity, we see leaders coming out of the boarding system into the world ill-equipped to understand vulnerability because they can't see the vulnerability in themselves. They have these very fragile survival strategies, as you said, and once they're taken out of the schools, they create power structures that are like the schools, so they sort of feel at home, but ultimately it doesn't serve them or the people.
No, and doesn't it make sense that lots of people that come from that system go into very hierarchical organisations, military, captains of industry, politics,
Judiciary.
judiciary, command and control, very rigid, very concrete, not necessarily very compassionate, not necessarily emotionally sensitive and intelligent, not where that stuff gets valued in the same way, maybe. So I can see that that kind of experience would make you very effective in a military context, for example. That you can see how that would work. Put your emotions to one side, don't need to rely on anybody else, be single-minded, outcome orientated, have a survival mindset. Perfect training, isn't it?
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for taking that little detour with me. There was one thing that came up that I did just want to speak about before we circle back, was something I've heard about recently. So we talked about ACEs, adverse child experiences. I'm hearing a lot about adverse school experiences, and you talked there, one of the biggest predictors was that secondary school experience. I hadn't heard a lot about adverse school experiences. Could you talk a little bit about your understanding of that? Is that what a word that's coming into sort of?
I've not heard that term before, actually. I think clearly school is an experience for lots of people is adverse. I think what we know is that very often for people, transition between primary and secondary school can be a very stressful change. So you go from being part of this little community where you're known and seen and heard and valued and connected to this huge machine where you're probably none of those things initially, and that's a huge shock. So I think secondary school is a challenge for lots of young people. I think the things that we're hearing about, the things that we're reading about are things like the punishment-based regime, the behaviourist regime, which doesn't take into account the reasons why a young person or a child might be behaving in a certain way. So, for me, discipline is about teaching something, right? So if I've got it wrong, if I've made a mistake, what I need is for someone to educate me, to teach me a better way so that I want to do it differently, not that I'm going to do it differently because I'm afraid of you. But to do that, discipline needs to be about teaching something in the context of a safe relationship with someone you trust, not about punishment. So that's the thing. I think in a lot of schools, we are still seeing a kind of behaviourist, punishment-orientated regime, like isolation booths, which I just think is awful. Like there's a reason why solitary confinement is one of the worst punishments that happens in the kind of prison system around the world, because humans don't cope well when they're isolated. And if a child's had an emotional outburst in a classroom and then he's sent to an isolation booth where they've got no contact with people, there's no one there to help co-regulate their emotions, no one's asking them, why are you upset, why are you angry, why are you frightened? Instead, you're kind of punished for having these sometimes overwhelming emotions. And that doesn't mean there isn't consequences, and it doesn't mean there isn't a holding to account. It doesn't mean that. It just means that we have to also think about helping young people regulate their emotions, understand their emotions, make sense of why they're feeling what they're feeling, and be there to help them cope better with that. And also, if they're going through difficult things at home or in the community or at school, have the kind of relationship where they can talk to us about that stuff.
Yeah.
Sticking them in an isolation booth with some banal, mind-numbing task to do as a punishment is not going to help them behave better, follow the rules, understand the rules, interact better with their peers, deal with whatever problems they're dealing with. It's just not. It's missing the point, I think. So I think I can see why school can be quite traumatizing. Plus, there's also that, when I was at school, and I think it still happens to some extent, shame was used as a weapon by teachers. Humiliation, embarrassment. I think those are the things that I think affected me the most.
Yeah.
Violence was obviously from teachers was not uncommon, but I don't think those are things that left me with the scars. I think it was actually sometimes a shaming that teachers would do. So I think those things, whilst I think those things are much less, I still think that they happen.
Thank you.
It's shift our attitude towards behaviour. Behaviour is an illustration of someone's emotional state. In cognitive therapy, we say event, thought, feeling, behaviour. That's the order. Something happens, you have a thought about it, that leads to an emotional reaction, and that affects your behaviour. That isn't that complicated. But instead of going, well, what happened to that? Why did they have this emotional reaction? And what were they thinking when they started to feel that way? And what's happened to this person? Instead of doing that, we go, that's unacceptable. You know the rules, off to isolation or off to detention or whatever it is. But it's not, I'm not for a minute saying, this, I'm not holding teachers to blame on this. I think the education system is under so much pressure that teachers tell us that they have an impossible task. They've got a class of 30 children. One of them has emotional needs. They have to decide, am I going to carry on teaching the class and ask that child to go off to speak to somebody else? Or am I going to meet the emotional needs of that child and ignore the learning needs of the other 29 students? What am I going to do? So quite often there's not the capacity, the time, even if the will's there to meet those emotional needs, there's just not the opportunity. So I think schools are under huge pressure. They're under-resourced, overburdened. They don't get enough support from external agencies on the whole. Most schools tell us they need more of that. And there are big wait times in services like CAMS and, special educational needs and education health and care plans. There's a lot of those. Loads of students have got those, but whether they can be fulfilled due to limited resources is another matter altogether. So yeah, I think there's a lot of reform necessary in the education system. I think there are amazing people working in schools and colleges in our country, but unfortunately they're leaving the profession in droves because it's not. Sometimes the job just isn't doable. It's not sustainable.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I hear you, Warren. I think the biggest thing we hear pupils and teachers is burnout. They're all just burnt out. The kids are burnt out from trying to get it right all the time and do a 12-hour day with homework and extra clubs and and the teachers are burnt out trying to sort of be all things to all people. Sometimes I was talking to my other half as a teacher last night. So sometimes going into a class with 8 or 9 pupils, all with a different coloured piece of paper that about a different need that they have to try and meet, and they're trying to dodge around a class of 20 or 30, meet the special educational needs of maybe 8 or 9 as well, and deliver a curriculum and make sure their results are perfect. And and it's just like, well, hang on a minute, and the teachers don't get then their own support very much. They're often just burning out in droves. So
that sounds overwhelming just listening to it. and often teachers in initial training are not taught about child development in detail, about child psychology, about mental health issues, about special educational needs necessarily. And if they do, it's often not in enough detail, or they're not equipped or feel competent. Because often the complexity they're dealing with is just beyond what is reasonable to expect for a maths teacher. They're not signed up to be an expert in all of these issues. So I think it's a very, very difficult job. And as you said, they're not always being supported themselves in a way that allows them to unburden and process and make sense of what's happened and feel connected to their colleagues. And one of the things we did in the trial was reflective practice for staff. And we got and it's not a tradition in schools. It is in psychology, it is in speech and language therapy, it is in nursing. But in lots of professions, it isn't a part of their tradition, part of their practice. But we introduced this into schools in a trial, and we've had a really positive reaction from it. I'd say there was some initial resistance because people were like, well, we're too busy already. You're asking us to do something else. But once they'd experienced it, really positive feedback. A couple of the schools we worked with in the first cohort described it as transformational, that they were kind of on that cusp of burnout, as you said, Chris. And then after the few sessions of reflective practice, the group reflective practice that we facilitated, they were saying, "Oh my God, I'm starting to love my job again. I feel like I'm seeing things clearly again. I'm not shouting anymore. I feel like I've got more to offer emotionally, whereas before I was completely saturated." So I think looking after the people that look after the people in education, in healthcare, in social care, in policing, this is one of our biggest priorities, because in all of those professions and sectors, the workforce is the biggest risk. People are leaving because it's just not doable. So unless we get better at protecting people from the slings and arrows of that job, we're not going to have public services that function.
No, I hear
We
you.
can't just keep burdening people with stress and expecting them to tolerate it, to weather the storm.
Yeah.
The evidence is that that's not working. So,
No. Thank you, Warren. That's really powerful. Really hearing you there. Looking after the people who are looking after others. It's so important. Training the trainers, and I just want to use that as an opportunity to sort of segue back with your journey. So, off to university in psychology, Hull. When I did the bio sort of read out at the beginning, we talked about working in asylums and things like that. So I'd love to hear some of your, because I can see how your role has pivoted over time. But for those listening, what was the learnings from that period, and kind of what were you carrying into it from your own life as well?
Well, I think I mentioned at the beginning, I had some exposure to severe mental illness, locally when I was growing up. So I was always fascinated by it. And also at university, I saw several of my sort of peers struggle with very significant mental health issues that emerged in that new chapter of their lives. Often those experiences were originated in past adversity. So I was like, wow, this is everywhere, One student on our course, we think, took their own life because they disappeared, they were never found. So it was like, wow, this is like meant to be, an amazing new chapter in people's lives, and yet all these people around me are suffering with serious mental health issues, and it turns out that they're a manifestation of former adversity. So that was really interesting and really, formative for me. So when I left university with a degree in psychology, I thought, well, do you know what? I'm interested in clinical psychology. I'm interested in why people become unwell and what we can do to support them to recovery and, getting back to a fulfilling life. So I thought I need to get some experience. So I applied for a job. My first job was at Burnley Hospital, and that was in the resettlement team, which was basically helping people that lived in asylums for decades, 30, 40, 50 years sometimes, to be resettled into the community. So it was a policy called Care in the Community, which was basically shutting down all the long stay hospitals, which in principle is a very sensible idea. But when you've been institutionalised and lived there your whole life, your whole adult life, how are you going to cope living in the centre of town, in a multiple occupancy house, when you've not really had to do anything particularly independently for the last 50 years? So that was my first job. My second one was at Prestwich, which was huge mental health hospital in Manchester. Really fascinating experience, just seeing how disabled people were by institutionalisation, seeing how damaged people were by the drugs that they'd been given, and also seeing the prevalence of adversity in people's lives. So all of those things made me realise institutionalisation is not helpful. It's disabling and damaging for both staff and service users. Polypharmacy with antipsychotic drugs for many decades is actually quite damaging to people's health. Probably adds to the problem. And then thirdly, there was a predominance of adversity in people's lives that wasn't being addressed. I didn't see any trauma therapy for those people, not once. So it made me realise that kind of policy of containment was really damaging, and probably, that was the care we offered for people, but actually it was a really disabling and damaging form of containment. And we're kind of still doing it with prisons, aren't we? We don't give people the rehabilitation, the therapy, the social support to live better lives or overcome their addictions or mental health problems, because they don't get that treatment in the way that might lead to a positive outcome on the whole. So yeah, it was a really interesting experience. And the other thing that I took away from that was, if you ask people what happened to them in an appropriate way, they tend to tell you. And if they tell you about the bad things that have happened to them, you can then ask them if they need some help with that. Are those things that happened to you when you were younger still troubling you? If they are, how does that show up in your life? And have you ever had any help with that? And do you want some help with that? Those questions for me were incredibly powerful. And what I realized very quickly was, you start asking people those questions, you find out pretty soon that actually everybody you're working with has experienced trauma and it's not being addressed. So the fact they've been in hospital for 50 years and not got better tells us something. If they'd been asked when they were in their 20s, when they got first admitted, what's happened to you? And they said, well, actually, I've been physically abused by my stepdad, or I've been sexually abused by my teacher. You could say, wow, is that still happening? If it is, we're going to protect you. If it's not happening anymore, is it still troubling you? Yeah, it's affecting my mental health. That's why I feel paranoid. That's why I'm having these, I'm hearing the voice of this person. Okay, well, maybe we need to address that traumatic experience. Let's see what we can do to help you. That would have been a far better outcome at that point than 50 years of antipsychotic medication, hospital, and electroconvulsive therapy. So that was my kind of like epiphany, I guess, during that period. And then I spent the rest of my career working in early intervention in psychosis. So trying to see people as soon as possible after the first signs, asking them what happened, and trying to give them psychological help, because whilst drugs might be helpful on the journey, they're not going to deal with unresolved trauma.
No, I hear you, Warren. I'm feeling very moved by what you said. It's very simple suddenly, but I just think even about our name, we're called Seen and Heard because ultimately that's all people need to be. Say seen and heard in the right space by someone who cares for them in some way, whether it's professionally or personally.
Yeah.
So it's really beautiful to think of that. And ultimately, we did a podcast with John Wedger, the ex-police detective, the other day, and his work around paedophile rings, etc. But he worked on the streets of London in the Met for years, and he said he never met street prostitutes, street drug users who hadn't had sexual abuse as a child.
Yeah.
Because he was the first copper to ask them. The rest they were just locking them up. But he was the first to say, what happened to you? What's your story? Oh, I was abused at home. I was abused at wherever. It's awful. Absolutely.
Chris, the thing that stands out for me is that quite often people would say to me, why are you the first person to ask me about this? I've been in services for 20 odd years. No one's ever asked me what happened to me before.
Christ.
I'd be angry about that.
Yeah.
So I've never had any complaints when I ask people about what happened to them. I've never had any complaints by people saying, why are you asking me that? It's inappropriate. But I have had complaints of people saying, why have I been given all of these drugs and admissions and electroconvulsive therapy, but I've never been asked what happened to me? You're the first person to ever show an interest. That's a fundamentally broken paradigm, isn't it? A broken system that doesn't look at the cause. So I firmly believe we can't keep treating the symptoms and not addressing the cause, because it isn't working.
No, thank you. Yeah, it all comes back. It all comes back to ACEs and what's happened along the journey. So when we did the setup, that you advocate very much for this sort of routine inquiry into adverse childhood experiences. It doesn't seem to be standard practice. What's your feelings on that? What's the change?
Well, since my experiences that I just described to you, I made it a routine practice for myself and encouraged it in my team as well, to ask people routinely as part of their assessment what happened to them. but do that explicitly and clearly. So rather than saying, "Oh, how was your childhood?" to which you often get the answer, "Pretty typical, standard, average." You ask a different question. I'd kind of introduce it by saying things like, "I ask everybody these questions because we know that bad things happening in childhood, stressful things happening in childhood, sometimes called traumatic events, they're really common, actually. We know that they can have an impact on your mental health, how you cope with relationships, how you cope with stress, how you parent, how you are at work, how you are in your relationships with drugs and alcohol. It can have an effect on lots of things. So we ask people about those experiences in some detail so that we can understand whether that's a factor and whether that's something you need help with. How would that be? Would that seem reasonable? Are you okay with that if we ask those questions? And then the person can say, "No, I don't really want to talk about that right now," or they can say, "Yeah, that makes sense." And then even if they don't want to talk about it later on, very often I'd have people coming towards the end of therapy saying to me, "You know what? There's something I've not told you, and I think it's really relevant, but I've not felt comfortable. But now I feel like I can trust you, and now I want to tell you." So you leave the door open. You're showing people that matters, that it's something you talk about routinely. It's not going to be a shock. It's not going to be a surprise. There's no judgment. We're here to hear this if you are willing to share it with us. So if you set it up in a way that is in context, most of the time people will talk to you about it, but you've got to ask explicit questions, which is why in our REACH approach, which stands for Routine Inquiry About Adversity in Childhood, which is an evidence-based method that's been tested and evaluated lots of times by academics. We start by introducing the rationale, then we use a questionnaire so it's very, very clear and explicit, and studies suggest that if you use a questionnaire, you get more disclosures because it's clearer what you're asking. The other thing is when you've got a questionnaire, people don't have to say it out loud. They can just write it on the piece of paper and go, "Look, I've experienced those things. I don't really want to talk about them in any detail, but I want you to know what's happened." Or if they're not comfortable with that, Chris, they could just write on the form a number. They could say, "Well, I've had 3 of those things. I don't really want to go into which ones they are, but suffice to say they have affected me. They're still affecting me, and I probably need some help with it." And when they're ready, they can talk to you about what those things were if they want to. But either way, what this does is facilitate a conversation that feels normal. It feels routine. It gives that person a sense that this is something that you ask everyone because it is common. It's not just you. And it's okay to have this conversation. I'm comfortable with it if you are. What you don't want is, I always say what you don't want is imagine you go to the dentist with a really terrible toothache and the dentist takes a look and goes, "Oh, I really don't like the look of that. Oh, wow, yeah, it's making me feel queasy. Yeah, that's pretty awful. It's going to be a difficult afternoon." Yeah. So you don't want that. You want, "Okay, yeah, no problem. We can work with this. Absolutely. Take a seat. We'll make you comfortable. I do this all the time. It's fine."
Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful. I love the way you said that. I think it's absolutely spot on. Yeah. That holding space, that holding safe space. Just it doesn't matter. It's almost like whatever you're going to say is not going to shock me. I'm not going to walk away. I'm not going to leave you.
Yes.
Ultimately, I'm here for this. And so that's the REACH model, which I know is part of the work that you do at Warren Larkin Associates. So tell us a little bit more about setting Warren Larkin Associates up and kind of, you came out of practice with the NHS, many different roles we talked about in the intro, but what prompted you to set it up? And we've heard some of the studies you're doing and the REACH, but give us a bit more of an overview.
Well, I left the NHS in 2017 after 25 years, which was sad on one level, but on the other hand, it felt like the only appropriate option. I didn't really have a plan, if I'm quite honest, but I did a lot of public speaking. People would see me speaking at events. They would resonate with what I was saying and get in touch and go, "Wow, you talked about routine inquiry about adversity. Can you help us train our team to do that confidently?" Or, we have a team of mental health nurses or social workers. practice is pretty variable. They're lacking in confidence when it comes to talking about trauma and how to respond to it. Can you help us get better at that, So initially it would be very much people would hear me speak about the subject and they'd get in touch, and I'd work with their team or their service or their organisation. Then I kind of got asked to do some sort of policy advisory work here in Scotland and also in Europe. And then actually after that, what happened was people started presenting me with problems and going, right, you're an expert in trauma, adversity and resilience. What is this thing called trauma-informed practice? How do we make it a part of our organisation? And where do we start? So I would start by meeting people and talking to them and listening to them and hearing their experiences. And that scoping exercise became a methodology. And that methodology became really reliable and really effective because we did it lots of times. And we call that a collaborative inquiry. So we learned that if we ask questions in certain ways, if we do focus groups, if we do confidential surveys, people tell us what is good and bad. People tell us what they need and what they want. People tell us what they love about their job and what makes them want to leave. People tell you what they understand about trauma and what they don't. People will tell you about how stress affects them and how it affects their performance at work and their well-being. So that was the next step. We started learning about engaging with the workforce and the stakeholders and finding out how to co-produce a plan with them. After that, we realised that actually most people don't know much about trauma, adversity and resilience. So we developed a foundational level of training, which was basically get everyone on the same page. Like basic safeguarding training is fundamental. For me, this is fundamental. People, if you work with people, you need to understand stress, adversity, trauma, and how the recovery process occurs and what resilience is. So that's the foundational training. We've done that now to like 15 to 20,000 staff have been through that in the last 8 years, which is brilliant. We've trained police officers, football coaches, social workers, drug and alcohol workers, the list goes on, teachers, And then after that, we developed, the REACH model already existed, root and inquiry about adversity in childhood. So we've been delivering that since I left the NHS, and we've done a massive county-wide implementation in Nottinghamshire across a whole range of different services, and they're now sustaining that after 5 years. So that's a big implementation. So that's wonderful to see. And then the other thing that I was presented with as a problem was that when you give staff some foundational training, the next thing they ask you is, they go, wow, that's amazing. I see things differently. How can I do more? What can I do? Now I know about this stuff. What can I do? And you go, okay, have you done any training in counselling or CBT or DBT, whatever? And people go, well, no, because I've never had any of that. But yet you're dealing with people with complexity and lots of needs. Yeah. So it became apparent that the majority of people that work in helping services haven't had any therapeutic training, any psychosocial therapeutic training. So I used to do some training in the NHS that was really about upskilling staff in psychosocial interventions. So I looked at the evidence, I looked at what was reasonable and appropriate for a multi-agency workforce, and I put together 10 ideas and techniques from psychological practice that could be appropriately utilised by a support worker, a social worker, a health visitor, a GP. And we now deliver that course called Therapeutic Skills for People with a Relational Role. It gives people a greater repertoire, more competencies, more skill, more confidence. And not only does it benefit the service user, it benefits the staff member because they feel they're not overwhelmed by what they're dealing with every day. They've got a few more tools in their toolkit. So that's the other thing that developed. And then finally, we realised that actually this workforce problem, this people exiting these professions and being burnt out, is like the common cold, of helping professions. So we did two things. One is we trained staff and managers about stress, about burnout, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, moral injury, how to spot it and how to avoid it. and then what managers and leaders can do to help their staff stay healthy at work. And then we do reflective practice groups. So we offer either to facilitate the reflective practice groups or to train people to facilitate reflective practice groups. Looking after the people who look after the people, bringing them together, helping them connect and support each other and process this difficult stuff they have to do every day, so that they're not getting to the end of their career and they're just overwhelmed and exhausted and need loads of therapy. And I spent my older adult placement, Chris, when I was training, working with lots of people who'd retired, who then developed health problems, who were ultimately had 30 years of soaking up other people's stress. And then suddenly they've got all this time on their hands and all of this stuff starts seeping out.
Mm.
And then it affects their mental health.
Mm.
So then they have to deal with it. So this bringing together in a reflective space to process and make sense of the things that are happening, good and bad, is a really healthy thing to do, as opposed to suppressing it, carrying it until you finish, and then it just emerges to be dealt with.
Yeah, thank you, Warren. It sounds like a really thorough approach. I'm loving some of that, and I also think a bit like, you know, if you train as a counsellor or a therapist or whatever, you do your own work along the way. So I imagine training the trainers, if you like, there's more than a few moments where they go, I wonder about myself and all this. It's not just the people I'm looking after. It's like, when does this show up in my life? You start asking those quite, compassionate self-inquiry. What's my part in all this? And did you see that along the way?
A lot, very often. Every time, I would say confidently, every time I deliver a training in any of those things, I'll get emails from people afterwards or a conversation if it's in person. And people say, I've had certain experiences. I never really thought about how it affected me before, but I've had a bit of a window of insight, an epiphany. Or I'll get an email saying, that was really important to me, not only as a professional, but also on a personal level. I've reconnected with some of the things that maybe I need to acknowledge and deal with. So this work is as much about the practitioner as it is about the service user at the end of the recipient of the care. It's absolutely about both. Yeah. We're not us and them, are we? We're like, I'm affected by trauma, you are, but also you're helping people who are affected by it as well. So it's all of us.
Yeah, that's the approach is to lead from within. The compassionate leadership approach is you get yourself sorted first. If you want to work with others, help others, lead others, you've got to know your stuff. So thank you very much. And there's one thing I don't want to, as time starts to run low for us today, I don't want to come out of this without having talked about the book, because it must have been such a huge piece of work amidst all of coming through the NHS and Warren Larkin Associates later on. What was the book, and how did it come about?
Well, it's conveniently placed here, Chris.
Hey, good plug.
There's two publications that I probably meant. This was in 2006. Trauma and Psychosis: New Directions for Theory and Therapy, with my colleague and supervisor at the time, Tony Morrison. So this was basically a response to the medical model of psychiatry and mental health. And we'd done all of this work recognizing that people's trauma and adversity was contributing to their psychosis, their bipolar problems. And when you ask the right questions, people tell you what's going on. So it demanded us to collect all the evidence together that said life events have a profound influence on mental health. And the evidence is that when people go through lots of trauma, the risks of them developing psychosis are much greater. So we made the case that this is a relationship that matters. And then we made the case that there are ways of making sense of this from a biopsychosocial perspective. And myself and Tony proposed a cognitive model, which could guide treatment, psychosocial treatment. And then we provided, from various experts, case examples of how we could effectively work with people who were traumatized, who were experiencing psychosis. And if you remember at the time, the idea was that the prevailing wisdom was psychosis is a brain disease, and it's caused by too much dopamine. And it's also, there's a degree of heredity as well. We were saying, well, actually, life events are probably a more powerful influence, and they're things we can do something about because we've got very effective psychological therapies for trauma. So maybe we need to stop thinking that the solution is purely about correcting the imbalance of dopamine and think about what's happened to people, because the people we meet, their paranoia is based on real things that happen to them. Their delusional beliefs are representations of things they're trying to make sense of. Their voices are very often, the identity of those voices is people have hurt them. We have to start thinking about the causes of these things rather than just the symptoms. So this was quite controversial at the time. And I remember one of my first days in a new job. I got a new job as my first consultant job. And I remember the medical director inviting me for a meeting. My first few days, I was like, oh, that's very nice, and it's very lovely to give me a welcome, But the short version of that talk was, don't be going on about life events causing psychosis. We all know it's a brain disease. I don't want you causing any trouble. That was the talk. But that was in 2006. And today, NICE guidelines, which are the kind of clinical excellence guidelines, say that if someone has psychosis or showing the signs of psychosis, they should be assessed for trauma. So that's now standard practice. Beautiful. Whereas back then it was seen as very controversial. So that was the book. And then more recently, we've published the Adverse Child Experiences card deck, which is a series of cards that allow you to have this conversation about adversity, the impacts of it, and resilience factors, protective factors, and then where you want to get to, your hopes and dreams. So this was born out of doing the REACH training. Many times practitioners would say to us, it's like life deals you a hand of cards, right? Sometimes it's a good hand and you're privileged, you're lucky, you're fortunate. And sometimes the hand of cards is not so good. But you've got to learn how to play those cards because that's all you've got. And I thought, wow, that's a wonderful metaphor.
Beautiful, yeah.
So why don't we do something with that? So we created the cards, and one deck of the cards, one suit is adversities, and there's about 30 of those because obviously there's more than just 10, all from the evidence research. Then there's a list of impacts, common impacts, using drugs to cope, using food, using alcohol, difficult relationships, etc. So people can go, this happened to me, this is how it's affected me. And then we look at resilience in childhood and resilience in later life. Have you had any of those things, or maybe you need some of those things? And then finally, where do you want to get to? What are your hopes and dreams? So there's an arc here. Rather than just going, what are the bad things that happened? This is, what happened? How did it affect you? What's been protective and how have you coped? What are these other things that you might want to acquire and rely on to cope that we can help you with? And maybe where do you want to get to? What can we aim for? So those cards are a way of having that conversation in a much more interactive, visual, flexible way.
Beautiful.
And people really like them,
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. It was lovely as soon as you said that. And A, that there's more than 10, very important to notice that. B, that, they're going to show up, in people's lives. And, I'm a great believer in where your wound lays is where your gold is. So if you can start to make that move around from saying, yeah, these things happen to me, but like I said, it's what I've been dealt. What am I going to do with it? My pain, my wound can suddenly become a light for others. It can become something very powerful.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
As we're coming to the end of our time, sadly, and we've got so much to connect about. We're always going to run out. But I know someone we've both crossed paths with recently. And I think you interviewed him on your podcast, which is really, really excellent for anyone wanting another podcast to check it out. Benjamin Perks and Trauma Proof. Yeah, but that idea that it's our generation's gift to the world to bring trauma awareness through, like it was previous generations bringing through vaccines or fighting the war or the Industrial Revolution or whatever. This is our sort of hill to live and die on. What's your take on that?
I agree. I think, when I joined the NHS 30 years ago, we didn't talk much about mental health issues. We were encouraged not to talk about suicide, in case we gave people ideas, we were told not to engage with people around delusional beliefs. Don't encourage them, Today, we know all those things are not very helpful. Actually, we need to be really open about mental health. We need to talk about our gender, spiritual, historical needs. We need to be heard and listened to, and those parts of us need to be valued as well. So our approach to talking about mental health and trauma, it's changed over the last 30 years. And I think there's still some barriers to people talking about trauma, because research tells us that survivors often try and tell, but they're not heard.
Yeah.
Or they seek help, but they're not given it.
Yeah.
Or they're just denied. It's just like, well, we don't believe that happened, often in families or in institutions. It's like, oh, let's just like move on, so I think our understanding of mental health, our understanding of neurodiversity, our understanding of trauma and how it affects mental health, physical health and social outcomes is a new frontier. And I think that we need to be educating professionals about that for sure. I also think it's really important that we educate parents and prospective parents, young people, about this, because if you're a parent and you don't know that sticking an iPad in your 3-year-old's playpen for 6 hours whilst you get on with whatever you're doing, that's not a life hack. That is actually affecting your child's brain development. It's affecting their social development. It's affecting their attachment with you. All of those things, if you don't know that stuff, you don't know it. So, like a lot of people say, well, yeah, I was hit at school, or my parents used corporal punishment. It didn't do me any harm. But yeah, you ask them a few questions and you find out later on that, yeah, they think violence is a solution for problems. They think it's okay to be emotionally distant with their children. They've struggled in relationships. And you think, well, you might not think it's had an effect on you, but actually, these things do. These things do have an effect. So I think we have to put this information into the hands of as many people as possible, who will, in turn, do good things with that information. They'll find better solutions, better ways, make better decisions.
Beautiful. Well, what a lovely way to start to bring things to a close. I think that's a real mission. Your contribution to that work has been really, really powerful. I just want to acknowledge and honour your work in this area. I think it shapes a lot of our thinking, seen and heard. And I know Piers Cross, others, the film. We very much respect what you're doing. Final thoughts then from you. Is there anything you just want to leave people with? Anything you want to mention before we wrap up?
That's a very good question. What do I want to leave us? I think I've reluctantly come round to the idea that I think schools are a real priority for us with this movement of trauma-informed practice. It's one of the most influential periods of our life. We spend more time in school than we do at home. It's a mixing, melting pot for social, emotional, pro-social development. And my ambition and hope will be that every child in every school feels safe, that they feel validated and loved, even though you might not like using that language, but they should feel loved. And I also think that they should instantly be able to tell you of a trusted adult they could talk to if they had a problem. I think that's the minimum requirement. And if every single school had that, children would be more likely to talk about what they need. They'd be more likely to get the right help. They'd be more likely to feel safe enough and secure enough to learn. They would be seen, they would be heard, and everything else would fall into place.
Absolutely.
I know I'm oversimplifying things, but I do fundamentally think that the social and emotional well-being of children not only determines academic performance, but it determines their development as people, and that is so important, and we can't get that back. Once they've left education, we can't get that back. No. Such a massive opportunity to engineer those positive childhood experiences into people's lives, which can be protective against those adversities that we might not be able to prevent. So I would say, yeah, let's kind of make that possible in schools. Let's support teachers and educational staff to have enough time, capacity, knowledge, skills to do that work, and for the government to support schools, the school system, to enable that nurture and that care and that emotional nourishment that children need.
Thank you, Warren. Powerful words to finish. And I think, I know deep down as well, things like, the costs for mental health, physical health, criminality, societal breakdown, drug abuse, all this stuff in adulthood, it doesn't go away, but it massively decreases if we can get the early years right. We know that, right?
Completely. I mean, I think Public Health Wales estimated that if we could prevent adverse child experiences affecting the next generation, we would see 60% less crack and heroin use, 50% less people going to prison, 50% less people being either the perpetrator or victim of violence in any 12-month period. So many of the ills that we're dealing with in society, many of the problems, many of the things that drive demand in the health system, that would reduce dramatically if we could protect people from the impacts of this harmful stress. And that a lot of that is about investing in the early years. And then after that, it's about investing in schools and education and emotional well-being at schools.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So Dr. Warren Larkin's been my guest today. It's been a wonderful conversation, and really, on a message of hope there at the end. This is within our gift to do. This is about psychosocial education. It's about in early interventions, about parents and schools and working with people and just listening to people, asking people, what's your story? What happened? Where you come from? So thank you so much for listening today. Thank you for taking the time, Warren.
Pleasure.
And, bless you for your amazing work. And thanks for listening to the podcast. We'll hopefully see you on the next one. It's been the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I'm Chris Braitch. This is Dr. Warren Larkin. Goodbye, Warren. And we'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.